Now, we know that there are several different types of vaccines in the world. We're going to talk about these four, mainly because we have recent data that shows the efficacy of these vaccines against the Delta variant. That is the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And they are different. The Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna, of course, are messenger RNA vaccines, and the Oxford-AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson are DNA that use adenovirus as the vector. And if you have more questions about that, look at our previous MedCram videos on those particular vaccines for more information about how they work. Now, as you know, these three first vaccines are first and second shot, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a one-time shot. Now, there's two different categories that I want to refer you to. And the first category that we're going to talk about is infection. So infection, what I mean by that is, does the vaccine prevent the individual from being infected and therefore prevent them from spreading it on to somebody else? That has great epidemiological importance in terms of stopping that R0 number and preventing the infection from spreading epidemiologically. And of course, who wants to get sick? Nobody does. But there's another important endpoint as well, and that's hospitalization. Does the vaccine prevent the most serious complications of getting SARS-CoV-2, which is, of course, COVID-19, hospitalization, high-flow oxygen, and ventilation, ARDS, things of that nature? And so those are going to be two different numbers. So let's talk, first of all, about the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Now, I'm going to be referencing a number of articles. Some of them have not been peer-reviewed, but it is recent data. I will give a link to all of these studies in the description below. So there was a UK study that showed after the first dose, so when we're talking about usually 2 weeks after the first dose, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine regarding the Delta variant, I'm talking about the Delta variant now specifically, was 33% effective after the first dose and 88% effective after the second dose at preventing symptomatic infection. And that was the UK study. Now, there was a Canadian study that came up with slightly different numbers. That was 56% after the first dose and 87% after the second dose. There was an Israeli study that showed after the second dose, they got 64%. And there was a Scottish study that showed 79%. Now, all of these are above 50% and would have been approved if this were the original virus. So I think these are all very good numbers. And again, we're talking about infection. Now, remember that the primary way that your body prevents infection is antibodies. And we know that the mutation that has caused this variant may be slightly off enough that some people's antibody responses may not be good enough at preventing infection. But remember that one of the things that helps you prevent getting worse is T cell activation. When T cells are replicated in the human body, they also are replicated in a way that is not perfect. So it allows for variants in the T cells. And so if you have variants in the virus and variants in the T cells, that will sometimes allow for a bit of change. The T cells can be effective at reducing hospitalizations and taking care of cells that are already infected. And therefore, what we typically find is that the hospitalization numbers are usually much better. So that same UK study found that after the second dose, there was a 96% prevention of hospitalization and death if you got the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine after the second dose. And when I say prevent here, I'm talking about efficacy. So in other words, if there's a 90+ efficacy, that would be in comparison to a control or where there's no vaccine, which would have a 0% efficacy. There was a Canadian study that looked after the first dose. There was a 78% reduction in hospitalization after the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccination, and that was the Canadian study. You might be wondering why we don't have data after the second dose. There wasn't enough data points to make that available in the study so far. There was also an Israeli study that showed in terms of preventing hospitalization after the second dose that it was 93% effective at preventing hospitalization and death in Israel. So the bottom line here for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is that despite the fact that Delta is more infectious and causes potentially more hospitalization, Pfizer is exceptionally good at preventing hospitalization and death from the Delta variant. What about Moderna? Well, there was a Canadian study that showed that after the first dose, there was a 72% reduction, and that was the Canadian study. In that same study, after the first dose, the Moderna vaccine was 96% effective at preventing hospitalization and death. Now, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which has been given authorization in the UK, after the first dose, they found it to be 33% effective at preventing infection, and after the second dose, 60% effective. And that was the UK study. In Canada, where it's approved, they found that after the first dose, it was 67% effective at preventing infection, and that in Scotland, after the second dose, it was again 60% effective at preventing infection. Now, what about hospitalization? Well, in that UK study, they found that it was 93% effective after the second dose, preventing hospitalization. In the Canadian study that they looked at, it was 88% effective at preventing hospitalization and death if you took the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccination. So again, very good numbers at preventing the worst outcomes. Now, what about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? That's a one-time shot. What they found is we don't have studies currently that look at the efficacy, but we do have some surrogates that could be very informative. Now, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was tested against the most strenuous variant, or the worst variant at the time, back about 6 months ago, and that was the South African variant. And when they tested the antibody response of the Delta variant in comparison to the South African variant, what it showed was that there was a higher level of antibody response to the Delta variant than there was even to the South African variant. In other words, a very good antibody response to the Delta variant. You may recall the South African variant with respect to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. There were no people who were hospitalized or died of the South African variant 49 days after they received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. In fact, Johnson & Johnson put out a statement saying that as time went on, the immunity got better up to even 8 months after the Johnson & Johnson vaccination. So because these vaccinations are so good at preventing hospitalization and death, and also reasonable at preventing infection, your risk from the Delta variant is going to be predicated on a couple of things. Number one, it's going to be predicated on whether or not you're vaccinated. So it's also going to be predicated on the amount of people in your area that are vaccinated. If there's a high frequency of vaccination in the population around you, then you're going to be more protected. And of course, the question also is how prevalent is the Delta variant in your community as well?